Hello, everyone, and welcome to the TF1 show. Now, I don't know, for those of you that watch this YouTube channel more often than not, or listen to this podcast, for those that can see, I'm in a bit of a new environment today. This is my temporary office. I'm on holiday, so I am bringing you this race recap from a bit of a different location. So just explaining the background. But, today I would like to recap the Bahrain Grand Prix. Oh, sorry, not the Bahrain Grand Prix, the Sakhir Grand Prix on the outer loop circuit. People called it an oval, but it's not really an oval. And I have to say, the word that I would choose to describe the Grand Prix was traumatizing. I think it was incredibly traumatizing. I'm still sitting here, and this is now being recorded, almost 24 hours after the race happened. And I'm still sitting here scarred. I'm going through a whirlpool of emotions. Of course, rage on behalf of George Russell, elation on behalf of Esteban Ocon, relief on behalf of Sergio Perez. So, there was just so many things that happened, and there's obviously a lot for us to discuss. So let's jump straight into the race recap, and let's start with Racing Point, since they are the victors on Sunday. And let's talk about Sergio Perez first. What a wonderful, wonderful achievement for Sergio Perez. I don't think there's anyone that could disagree with the fact that it was a well-deserved victory. This has now been coming a very long time. He has been regarded as one of the best drivers on the grid for such a long time as well. And it was just so refreshing to see him take the top step, and then also see him react in the way that he did, knowing that there is a very good chance that he's probably out of a seat at the end of the year, which in itself is, of course, a massive travesty. Now, I just thought he showed incredible pace throughout the race. He was just really, really fast, despite the fact that he was punted off by Charles Leclerc on the opening lap. And I'll talk about Leclerc and his new late braking habits later. But Sergio Perez, right from the back of the grid to the race victory, is just such an illustration of what makes him a good driver. He is always that typical race driver. He's the one that's going to sort things out for you on Sunday. He's the most reliable driver on the grid probably, and he just makes sure that he maximizes his situation in the race. And that is exactly what he did yesterday. His pace overall was incredibly impressive. I think, Alex Albon really wasn't able to stay with him, or he was barely able to stay sort of in contact with Perez after being overtaken. I think the only two cars faster than Sergio yesterday were the two Mercedes, and obviously we can talk about them now as well and everything that happened there. But I would like to give Perez the props that he deserves. Now, let's quickly discuss the seat situation for next year, because a lot of people then came out and said yesterday that, he now has a race victory. Alex Albon finished 6th. How can Red Bull not put Perez in the car? And I don't want to rain on anyone's parade, but I still don't think Red Bull are going to go with Perez at the end of the day. I think it might have strengthened his position slightly from Helmut Marko's perspective. Whether it has consolidated his position, I don't think so. I think there are a couple of things. Firstly, I don't think Red Bull want to waste all of the effort and time and money that they've put into Alex Albon now throughout the whole year. We have seen improvement from Albon from a pace perspective. Obviously, he's not there yet. And I think it's a question of Red Bull thinking whether they can get Albon, let's say, another 1 to 1.5 tenths closer to Verstappen. The second thing is, they might be worried that Perez could upset the working relationship that Verstappen and Red Bull and everybody has there at the moment, where Perez, we knew what happened with Ocon. They didn't have the best working relationship, and that was a bit of a function of both Perez and Ocon trying to be the top dog in the team and trying to assert their dominance, and we all know how that ended. And lastly, it sounds like Verstappen isn't that keen on having Perez in the team. I don't know why. I don't know of any beef between Max and Sergio, but it just sounds like that's not the desired pairing for Max Verstappen, and that they probably preferred Nico Hulkenberg, and if not Hulkenberg, then just sticking with Alex Albon. So I just don't, all of the noises that we've been hearing from Red Bull, from the people in the paddock, it just doesn't sound like Perez is going to get that seat, regardless of how well he does, in the last couple of races. And obviously, I mean, that's a whole separate discussion, the whole discussion around whether that is correct or not. I personally don't think it is correct. I would love to see a grid with the 20 best drivers on it. For me, the question is more, why the hell did Racing Point fire Sergio Perez? I think it's starting to look more and more embarrassing. Yes, Stroll got a podium today, but he was way, way slower than Sergio throughout the whole weekend and on race day. I mean, Sergio was literally drove past, it was 18th on the grid, and drove all the way up to Stroll and past him and beat him by 10 seconds. And that to me is a massive gap in performance. So, and this is, I guess, not the podcast or not the episode to talk about the whole Sergio Perez Racing Point situation. But long story short, Racing Point should never have fired Sergio Perez. They obviously would not have fired Lance Stroll, given the whole ownership situation. Sebastian Vettel, is he going to do a better job than Sergio? I don't know. I really don't know. I'm worried that Racing Point might have hedged all their bets with this 4-time world champion and that he's just not feeling it anymore. So it's going to be interesting to see. Can't wait to see how all of it pans out. But where we're sitting today, I think it's an absolute travesty that Sergio has a very real chance of not being on the grid next year, given how well he's driven, especially over the second half of the season. Okay, let's talk about his teammate Lance Stroll quickly. Now, obviously on paper, a really good result for Lance, a P3, a podium with his bestie Esteban Ocon. Now, the chips that sort of fall in Lance's favor, as it did for Esteban, I guess, and for Sergio to an extent. However, I think without all of the Mercedes dramas, Perez probably would have had the podium. He would have finished P3, where I think theoretically Stroll should have finished behind Sainz and behind Kvyat, if I'm not mistaken, and Ricciardo actually. So the safety car and the virtual safety car definitely ruined Sainz and Ricciardo's races, and obviously Stroll was the one to benefit from that. So you can't fault that. I mean, he put himself in the position to benefit, and as far as the race drive goes, this was a decent one. He didn't make too many mistakes, except the lockup when he allowed Perez to pass him, and then obviously Ocon also with a really good overtake got past Lance after the pit stop, the round of pit stops. But all around, an incredible weekend for Racing Point. They are back third in the Constructors' Championship, that incredible fight between McLaren, Racing Point and Renault for the third position. And this couldn't really have gone much better for Racing Point this weekend, especially after the disappointment from last week. Okay, let's talk about Renault, who came second with Esteban Ocon. Now, I'm so happy for Esteban, and I feel very vindicated because there's been multiple occasions on this podcast, on this channel, where I have supported Esteban and I have backed Esteban, and many a guest have come on and laughed at me. They've looked me in the eye and have laughed out loud at my brazen support for Esteban Ocon and my insistence that he's in fact a good driver. And I feel slightly vindicated after yesterday. He put in a really strong race drive. Obviously, similar to Lance, he did benefit from a bit of fortune when it came to the safety car, but he pulled an excellent overtake over Stroll, and he essentially, on all the tires, was able to extend and keep Stroll, Sainz, Bottas, all of them at arm's length at the end to secure a second place, which is incidentally his first podium of his career for Renault. So that in itself is a really massive achievement for Esteban. And I think, we all saw how happy and how relieved he was after managing to achieve that. I think it's brilliant. I really do hope he can build on this and that gives him a bit of confidence, because I do think in there is a really, really strong race driver, and it's just taken a while for it to come back out. We've seen glimpses of it over the last couple of races, both in qualifying and the race. And I think if you can finish Abu Dhabi strongly, he has a really good base and a foundation to build off of when we go into 2021, when he will obviously come up against Fernando Alonso. So next, we have his teammate, Daniel Ricciardo. So he came home in 5th place. Slightly disappointed at the end of the race. I think he thought there was maybe more opportunities around. Maybe if the pit stops worked out differently, if they didn't get undercut by Kvyat after the first round of pit stops, where obviously, and I think Daniel was stuck behind Daniel for a very long time during the middle part of the race. And I think that essentially put paid to his podium hopes. All round for Daniel, though, again, another strong performance. He was good in qualifying, put himself in a good position. I don't know whether the Renault had ultimate pace. I think the McLarens and the Racing Points and the AlphaTauris, I think maybe had slightly more pace ultimately compared to the Renault. So a 2nd place and a 5th place for that team is probably the best they could have hoped for. So yeah, I think Renault will leave relatively happy. Okay, next we have McLaren. Now, I again just want to emphasize that I personally feel that if everything played out in the way that it should have, Carlos Sainz would have gotten a podium today. I think he showed really, really strong pace. He was forceful at the start when Leclerc and Verstappen took each other out, and he put himself in that 3rd spot. He was running comfortably in 3rd place behind the 2 Mercedes on the opening stint. And then it all just unraveled for him when they pitted him just as the virtual safety car period ended, which essentially meant he was forced onto a 2-stop strategy because he essentially pitted twice without really getting the benefit of the VAC. I think all round, though, another really strong race drive by Carlos Sainz, a strong qualifying performance. He's now, I think, asserted himself again as the stronger McLaren driver over the season, despite all of the bad luck he had during the opening phases of 2020. He's been just come along really strongly, and I haven't really seen a bad race or a bad mistake from him since that dunder-headed move in Sochi where he drove into the wall. All around, I'm really positive performance by Carlos, and I would just like to reiterate again, can't wait to see him go up against Charles next year in the Ferrari. I think it's going to be a firecracking team, and there's going to be a lot of competition. I'm really, really keen to see it. Now, Lando, he had a bit of an anonymous race, although he did have a lightning start. I think he started from the back and he was running 10th after the opening lap, which is Carlos Sainz in his execution. I mean, Sainz like in the way that he sliced through the field and took opportunities there. So that's a really strong showing by Lando on the opening lap. After that, he was sort of stuck in no man's land. He just sort of settled down and didn't really threaten anyone ahead and got overtaken by Albon and by Perez. So probably wasn't quite on their pace. So yeah, I mean, sort of an average weekend for Norris, I'd like to argue. Okay, I want to jump to the Mercedes next, even though I don't think they finished that high up, because there's lots to say about Mercedes. And let's talk about the star of the weekend, and obviously the big news now with Lewis Hamilton testing positive for COVID-19. Get well soon, Lewis. Hope you're back soon. George Russell was asked by Mercedes to drive for the team over the weekend, and I was very excited. I thought this is going to be like a Leclerc at Ferrari moment. We're going to see Russell's pedigree finally shine through at a top team, and I'm very happy to announce that he exceeded even my expectations with, firstly, how strong he was in practice, despite the fact that he didn't really fit in the car, despite the fact he didn't know the systems in the team. He was running what? He was first in FP1 and FP2. FP3 was obviously a bit more of a struggle, but sounded like they tried out a couple of things with setup and, experimented a bit more. And qualifying was really, I think, as good as he could have hoped for. I think 26 100ths off Valtteri Bottas's time, and we know how close Bottas cuts, to Hamilton usually. So that in itself was a really, really strong qualifying performance. Mr. Saturday, I think he can maintain the title there. But what to me was truly the benchmark was how incredibly well he firstly started the race and then how he managed the race. I mean, sneaking past Bottas on the first lap, embarrassing for Valtteri, really strong for George, and then he just streaked off into the distance. He built a good gap to Valtteri, he maintained that gap up until the first round of pit stops, pulled off a massive undercut on Bottas, where I think he was 8 seconds ahead by the time that Bottas stopped. And after that, the thing is, we know what happened with Mercedes. Mercedes, they just messed up. Toto Wolff said it best with a couple of swear words. You can go and check out the Sky broadcast for that. Mercedes messed up. It hasn't happened ever. I've never seen that happen before. It was a miscommunication on the radio, and George's race just unraveled from there. What I again want to highlight is, despite the setback where George had to basically stop twice in 2 laps, and he was sitting behind Valtteri. I can't remember what position he was sitting in during the safety car period, but essentially passed all those cars, was running in P2. A brilliant pass on Bottas. Probably my favorite overtake of the season far. Everybody go watch it. It's all over social media. Go watch George Russell's overtake on Valtteri Bottas. I think such a good overtake. After going through all of that trouble, fighting through, running in P2 again, chasing down Sergio. I think it was 2 seconds behind Sergio, before he was told that he had a slow puncture and he had to pit again. And that essentially meant he was relegated right to the back of the field, because obviously we just ended a safety car period, so the field was really bunched up. And that put paid to George's race. He was able to fight back to a low point scoring position. I think he finished P9 at the end. So, good fighting qualities from George, great overtaking from George, good race management from George, good start from George. Really don't know what I can say in terms of criticism for George's race performance, other than it was Hamilton-like. I really think George managed that race like Lewis would have. It was so impressive in the way that he was decisive when he had to be. He was conservative when he had to be. I really don't have enough compliments for how well George performed there. And I think it is a crying shame that we have Valtteri in that seat next year. If I'm Toto Wolff, I'll try and pull some strings. I'll just get that guy in my car as soon as possible, because the top drivers and the best drivers, they're not going to hang around forever. Max Verstappen, Charles Leclerc, and now George Russell, other teams are going to go and they're going to swoop in and they're going to take him out of Mercedes' hands if they don't act as quickly as they can. And I think this weekend's performance has cemented Russell as in that same category, I would imagine, as also what Verstappen and Leclerc is placed in. And obviously he has the credentials from the lower formula to back it up. But man, that was such a strong performance by George Russell. I can't tell all of you how impressed I am. Conversely, we can talk about Valtteri Bottas, who obviously took over the team leader role this weekend with George now joining the team for the first time. And I don't think it went that well. Qualifying was a bit of a nail biter. I think he should have been further ahead. The race was a disaster. Obviously got mugged off at the start, had no race space to challenge Russell with. He was saying no, he would have challenged Russell at the end. I don't think so. I think Russell was maintaining a very nice little gap to Bottas right up until the end of the race. Got mugged by George in turn 7. Got stuck on the old tires, obviously, which is a bit of an excuse. But at the end of the day, you have to deal with what you have. And the fact that he couldn't pass, was it Ricciardo ahead of him or Kvyat? I wasn't impressed by Valtteri. And Toto Wolff actually wasn't impressed by Valtteri as well. He said it wasn't a great performance by Valtteri at the end of the day. And he's going to have to go speak to him and his team, because I don't think it reflected that well on Valtteri. And given the season and how it went, obviously he has had bad luck, right? Let's not deny Valtteri has had bad luck. And taking that out of the equation, he would have been closer to Lewis in the championship. But still, just thinking about his performances throughout the year, and then the way that fundamentally Russell completely smashed him in the race. Russell would have dominated that race if it wasn't for all of the pit stop dramas. That's a really, really big cross against Bottas's name. And I would like to reiterate, if it weren't for contracts, I would have probably thought that Mercedes would just get Russell in that seat next to Lewis. I personally don't think there will be that much fireworks between Lewis and George. I think they can work together quite nicely. Whether it becomes a fight for the championship, obviously it can become a bit acrimonious, but that's just the nature of the championship, I guess. I don't think it will have that personal feel that Hamilton and Rosberg had. I just think both Lewis and George are professional enough to be able to do the job for Mercedes. But at the end of the day, I guess it's just a pipe dream for me at the moment, and it's not probably going to happen. Okay, Red Bull. Now, Verstappen, not really that much I can say, to be honest. Obviously, he qualified as well as he could have, got really close to pole position. Good qualifying lap from him as always. Excellent job. The race lasted 3 corners for him. So he was basically a sitting duck, right? He was just taken out by or avoiding action to avoid Perez, who got hit by Leclerc. And then he got caught out by the gravel and just skidded into the barrier. And that was the end of Max's race. Now, Alex Albon had a rough qualifying. Sounds like they couldn't sort out. And this has been something he's been struggling with, I think, throughout, is the traction phase with that Red Bull and this is, I think, has been the reason why in recent races he struggled to overtake, where in the past, like even at the beginning of the season, he was actually really, really good on the overtaking. But he struggles with traction out of the corners. And I obviously don't know the reason for that. But Red Bull essentially admitted and said that the big thing for him this weekend and why he's struggling compared to Max is he's not getting traction out of the big braking zones and then obviously the long straights. And if you don't get out of the corner well, that's a penalty all along the straight until you get to the next corner. And that's just been the struggle for Alex this year. And obviously not great timing for him to struggle, not great timing for him to go out in Q2. I think he started P12 and he did fight up to P6. And I agree with Alex, actually, on the radio, he said he had good pace, and you can see he had good pace. But on the straights, the Red Bull was too slow and he didn't have the traction out of the corners, which meant that, especially compared to the racing point of Perez, he just couldn't get past. I mean, he was sitting in Perez's turbulence for quite a long time in that first and second stints, and he just couldn't make any progress. And then obviously under the safety car, Red Bull decided to put him again and put him on soft tires, which meant he got past Gasly and Kvyat, but then again ran into a similar problem where he was stuck in a DRS train with Ricciardo and Sainz and Kvyat and everything else. And that he couldn't pass because even he said with his DRS open, he was only a couple of kilometers an hour faster than the guys in front, despite the DRS and the slipstream, which just meant he couldn't overtake. But I mean, when your main rival for your seat next year wins the race after driving from the back of the pack, it is looking a bit ominous for Alex. I think objectively, and this is coming from me, right? And we all know how I feel about Alex Albon. Objectively, it's tough to justify keeping Alex in that seat over Sergio. But then I think when Red Bull asks itself the question, are we running the risk of having Sergio deal with what Alex and Pierre is dealing with? Is that what we want? Are we running the risk of just, Checo having the same problem? Because there's a possibility that there's something fundamental in the way that car works that Max seems to like, or that Max seems to drive around, that 85% of other drivers can't. And we've now seen it twice. And can Red Bull run the risk of putting another driver in there, getting burnt again, and then having to again rejig or make plans for their juniors come end of 2021? So it's really a difficult choice for them because I think they know that Alex is a known quantity. They know where his strengths and where his weaknesses are. They're going to have to ask themselves, can they get Alex's weaknesses up to a point where it's acceptable for them and he's close enough to Max? And then if the answer to that is yes, doesn't matter how well Perez is doing, I think Red Bull probably going to go let's keep Alex in the car. Let's keep him as a number 2 next to Max, and hopefully we can challenge for the constructors next year. So it's going to be a tough one. I actually don't know what the right answer is. Obviously, it's a bit of a head and a heart situation. My head says Perez, my heart says Alex Albon, and I don't know what Red Bull says. So we're going to have to wait and see. Okay, now let's talk about Ferrari next. And I have a bit of a bone to pick because on last week's podcast, I told Elliot, who was my guest on, I was very strong in my disapproval of the way that Leclerc went about overtaking Sebastian Vettel on the opening lap of the Bahrain Grand Prix and we saw this in Styria again, and then obviously Sebastian Vettel agreed with me because he was quite vocal about it on the radio. But the way that Charles just, whether it's the first corner or the third or the fourth corner, but on the opening lap where it's a bit of chaos, he has the tendency of just lunging on the brakes, being as late on the brakes as he can, sticking his nose up the inside, and then hoping and praying that whoever is ahead of him doesn't turn in or that they see him and take avoiding action. Now, that's what happened with Vettel last week, where Vettel obviously saw Charles, and then he was like, okay, well, he can't have an accident with his teammates, and then he just shuffled out of the way and essentially lost the place to Charles as a result of that. Now, this week, he tried the same trick on Perez into turn 4. Perez either didn't see him, which you don't blame him because Charles essentially came from nowhere and all of a sudden he was led on the brakes and alongside, and Perez turned in like he would have done. Charles realized, oh crap, I made a bit of a mess of this. He's too late on the brakes, locks up into the side of Sergio. Sergio goes round. Max tries to take avoiding action. Max into the wall, Charles into the wall. Both of their races ruined. Now, obviously, when Charles pulls off a move like this, and it works, he's seen as a hero. He's seen as a swashbuckling, late-breaking wonder child. But when it doesn't go off, like yesterday, it's a bit of a clumsy one, and he rightfully, in my opinion, got a previous race. Because at the end of the day, doing something like that isn't going to win you a world championship at the end of the day. You can't go for every gap that you see, especially if it's going to be a bit of a lunge and if it's going to be a bit out of the blue, because you are 100% relying on whoever you are going up against, firstly, for that person to see you, and secondly, for that person to not just be like, okay, well, I'm just going to shut the door and you're going to have to sort yourself out, which is essentially what Perez did, and look how that happened. Look what happened. So, yeah, I'm not impressed by Charles's racecraft all the time. I think he's a really, really strong racer. I think sometimes he is a bit young and a bit immature, similar to what we saw with Max, to be honest, a couple of years ago. So I think he's going to learn from this and probably not going to do it again. I just think that this was something inevitable that was going to happen eventually, because we saw him do it a couple of times this year. Obviously, his accident with Vettel in Styria, he got away with it last week against Vettel because Vettel decided to take avoiding action. And then this week again, it ended in tears for Charles. And I think it's such a big pity because his qualifying performance on the Saturday was unbelievable. Like he's so incredible over one lap when he gets it all, when he puts it all together. I mean, that Ferrari came out of nowhere to finish. I think it was P2 after the first runs in Q3, which is incredible. I can't believe Charles was able to pull that out of that car. So I just think he needs to be a bit more careful. He needs to think the long game and not only think how many positions he can make up on the opening lap, because at the end of the day, it's a marathon, not a sprint, Charles. Come on, Charles. You can do it, Charles. So that's my feelings about Charles's race. Some positives, some negatives, but at the end of the day, you can't just stick your nose in everywhere and hope everybody else just gives you the opportunity to show how good you are. Because, in the big boy leagues with Hamilton and Verstappen and Vettel, it's not going to end up like that all the time. You're probably going to get your fingers burnt more often than not. Now, Sebastian Vettel, really not much to say. It was pretty disappointing from him all around. He was struggling the Ferrari like we expected. He was spinning all over the place without any provocation. I mean, obviously we know the car is difficult to drive, especially for him. And it was another forgettable day. I mean, he finished out of the points. He qualified P11, P13, can't remember. I think P13 behind Albon. And that was basically that. He was very anonymous throughout the whole race, didn't really make any progress. And unfortunately, that has been the tail of the tape for Sebastian so far this year. Alrighty, let's talk about the remainder of the midfield quickly. So we've spoken about everyone except AlphaTauri, Haas, Alfa Romeo, and Williams. So let's talk about all of them briefly. For AlphaTauri, this was another good weekend for Daniel Kvyat. It's one of the couple of weekends that he's been able to outperform Gasly consistently. He put in a really good qualifying lap, I think to start P6. And he ran a good race to finish ahead of his teammates. Obviously, I think also got slightly screwed over by the safety cars and the VACs, but all around good pace. I mean, Daniel Ricciardo was struggling to get past him for the majority of the second stint. So good performance by Kvyat, an average performance by Gasly, a decent performance by Gasly. Didn't have the pace of Kvyat this weekend, but I mean, he wasn't miles away. So yeah, that's basically my AlphaTauri weekend. I've, for a while thought AlphaTauri might do a bit better. They were looking quite good on Friday and I think initially on Saturday, but at the end of the day, they got beaten by a couple of other cars. So yeah, I mean, that's basically that for AlphaTauri. I don't know what noise is going on in the background, but we're going to have to live with it till the end of the episode. But luckily, I'm almost finished. So let's talk about Haas next. Now, obviously, Grosjean was out of the seat after the accident last week, and in came Pietro Fittipaldi as their reserve driver. Now, I think he did a decent job, given that he hasn't driven a Formula One car in quite a while. He was a bit behind Kevin Magnussen, but not too far behind, which I think at the end of the day is fine, given that this was his first race in I don't know how long. So that's decent. Secondly, Alfa Romeo, Antonio Giovinazzi, Kimi Räikkönen. I think Giovinazzi was probably the stronger driver this weekend. It was borne out in the results. Not a massive difference between the two, though. And again, not really an out-of-this-world performance by either one, which is probably my biggest problem with Giovinazzi is, he does fine. He beats his teammate every now and again, but we haven't seen like the headline performance or race drive from him ever. It's never Antonio Giovinazzi, like what we see with George Russell, where he drags everything that you can, everything that you can expect out of that Williams sometimes, and he's sort of the cat in amongst the chickens and during some races, and even though he doesn't really belong there. And we just haven't seen that from Antonio Giovinazzi, and I think that to me is probably my biggest issue with him at the moment. Okay, everybody, and that is another episode of the TF1 show. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you agree with everything that I said. If you don't agree, please let me know down in the comments. I'm happy to debate with you. It's always interesting to hear your points of view. And I guess maybe now at this point, I can just get the admin out of the way and ask you to please subscribe if you haven't done so yet. Hit that notification bell as well, so you know whenever I make a new upload. And you can just hit that like button as well to show everybody how much you appreciate and love me, because I do need that validation in my life. Now, next week, we have the final race of the season, which is obviously very sad. But at the end of the day, it's been a really, really entertaining one. And I can't wait to recap the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix with all of you next week. Bye.